Hello, Trinity Tigers. Welcome to the Learning Together live webinar series as part of our lifelong learning initiatives presented by Trinity University's Office of Alumni Relations.
I am Aaron Delwiche, a professor of communication at Trinity University.
And I'm Jennifer Henderson, chair and professor of communication here at Trinity. We both have deep academic interest in today's webinar topic, and we're delighted to have this opportunity to share our research and insights with you today. A special shout out to all of our students and former students. It's great to have you in class again.
First, let me introduce Jennifer Henderson. She has served as chair of the communication department since 2010, half of her career at Trinity. Henderson's research addresses issues of media law, the ethics of media, and the use of participatory culture for political and social action, all topics she believes are now more important than ever. She received her doctorate from the University of Washington.
And now it's my turn to introduce Dr. Delwiche. He teaches courses on topics such as virtual world development, transmedia storytelling, and mobile game programming. Dr. Delwiche's current research investigates the emergence of bots and sock puppets, arguing that these technologies constitute a fake audience that poses a fundamental threat to global civil society. He received his doctorate also from the University of Washington.
Please know that you will be able to submit your questions as you listen to our conversation, and we will be happy to answer them.
So today we're going to be talking to you about the echo chambers and fake news, and we have lots to talk about.
So to get started, we wanted to ask what you might remember of the great Columbian chemical plant explosion of 2014. It happened on September 11th, 2014. Put your head back in time, try to remember what you read about it at this time. It started out with announcements on Twitter. People said that they had seen the Columbian chemicals plant in Louisiana exploding, that there was a fire and a leak. And other people weighed in on Twitter saying, I hope it wasn't a terrorist attack.
Then, local residents received this message. The content as stated by the text message is not true. There has been no release of such toxic gas, explosion, or any other incident at our facility. We are not aware of the origins of this text message. Law enforcement authorities have been contacted and are following up on this matter. The hoax was reported to have involved dozens of fake accounts that posted hundreds of tweets for hours, targeting a list of figures precisely chosen to generate maximum attention. The perpetrators didn't just doctor screenshots from CNN, they also created fully functional clones of websites of Louisiana TV stations and newspapers. It was one of a wave of similar attacks in the United States during the second half of 2014 that used these hoaxes, including fabricated Ebola outbreaks and police shootings, in an attempt to create public panic or outrage.
So you might be wondering, why would somebody do this? Why would somebody coordinate this massive campaign to simulate an event that never happened, or to simulate fake Ebola outbreaks? It turns out the story was actually distributed by an organization called the Internet Research Agency. Based in St. Petersburg, this group was responsible for a flood of fake news postings from 2014 to 2016. The IRA, the Internet Research Agency, employed 80 full-time employees, specifically flooding social media networks such as YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and Tumblr with anti-Clinton and pro-Trump propaganda. And the news stories were not just focused on the election. The group deliberately poked at wounds in the American body politic, amplifying polarization and divide around issues such as Black Lives Matter. Special counsel Robert Mueller indicted 13 Russian nationals and 3 organizations, including the Internet Research Agency, for, quote, conspiracy to illegally influence the U.S. presidential campaign.
But fake news is not gone. In fact, we've created just the right witch's brew to make the internet ripe for more fake news, not less. Right now, there are 5 converging factors that are confusing our content on the internet. The first of those is the decline of the news industry as we know it. In the map in front of you, red newspapers are ones that have completely closed, and the gray dots indicate newspapers that have moved from daily publication to weekly publication. All of these closures have led to a decline in revenue among news organizations. Between 2000 and 2015, print newspaper advertising revenue fell from about $60 billion to about $20 billion, wiping out gains of the past 50 years. and shuttering many of our traditional news sources altogether. But this trend isn't just one about moving from paper to digital. It's about losing journalists. So where did all of those journalists go? Many of them moved to advertising and online publications that publish sponsored content or native advertising, which we'll be discussing in a minute.
A second factor contributing to this confusion, to this flood of fake news, is the growth of the data economy. There are thousands of companies whose business model is built on the collection of information about you. You may have heard about some of them. Equifax, for example, who collects credit information. But there are other organizations, data brokers, whose sole purpose is to collect as many different and varied kinds of data about you to sell to others, usually advertisers, to target you more specifically with their messages. In advertising, we refer to this as big data analytics used for micro-targeting, which allows a marketer to select individuals who fit their very detailed profile to receive a message regarding their product. And we know, for example, that many of you are connecting to this or are contributing questions through Facebook. Facebook is a terrific example of one of these entities that's entire business model is predicated on collecting data about user behavior. Everything you like, you love, you laugh at, you cry at, you LOL or make a surprised face at. All of these little data points are building a detailed profile of who you are that can be then sold to advertisers.
The third of those things is the digital information overload. So honestly, all of us have way too much information in our lives to be able to process it. On the internet, there's no way that we could possibly get to all of the information that we would want to read about. So we've learned over time to take shortcuts, and technology companies are very happy to help us do this. So every time you're upgrading your phone from the 7 to the 8 to the X, for example, you like it because it's more convenient. It's helping you make shortcuts to information on the internet. But these shortcuts also play a huge role in how we consume information. The more shortcuts, the less we question the kind of information that we get.
A fourth factor which is contributing to this condition is the polarization of politics. And I'm sure it does not come as a surprise to anyone who is watching us right now for us to say that America is possibly more polarized than it ever has been in its history. One way of seeing this in action is to visit the site called the Red Blue Feed. And this is a site that is created by the Wall Street Journal. You can see it on the screen. It shows on the left side the blue feed. This is what liberal users of Facebook are most likely to be seeing in their news feeds right now. And the right side, the red side, is the conservative feed. And you can click through and look at various topics and see how people are having entirely different worldviews being represented and confirmed in their social networks. And this contributes to polarization. A fifth factor is malicious voices in the newsfeed. Some of you may have heard about something called trolls. You may have heard about Russian trolls or trolls connected to other countries in recent weeks. But we also like to think of these as sock puppets. And actually, sock puppet is a better term to describe this phenomenon. A sock puppet is a fake identity that is created online and maintained online for the purposes of deceiving other individuals. And in fact, there is software out there which makes it possible for people to maintain up to 10, 15, even 20 fake identities simultaneously. These are known as sock puppets. Sock puppets work in combination with bots. Bots are also fake accounts online, but the difference is that bots are not controlled by real human beings. They're actually controlled by software. There's an algorithm which pretends to be a human being. Bots are typically used to amplify disinformation, to retweet information. Bots and sock puppets working together have really contributed to the contamination of our information environment. This is an example of a Facebook sock puppet post. You can see it looks fairly believable, right? This actually pretends to be the Facebook page for somebody named Melvin Riddick. And it was created as part of a propaganda campaign. So taken together, these 5 factors leave us with a crowded, confusing content landscape, one that we all need help navigating. And to do so, we will begin at the beginning.
So today we're going to talk about 6 different types of news. And news you'll see are in quotation marks because this is often content on the internet that we confuse as news. Some of the content is actual news that we'll be talking about, but much of it is not. So we're going to step back a little bit and look at the different kinds of content we might be receiving. The first of those is hard news. So hard news is basically events that need to be reported immediately. Those are the kinds of things like a fire down the street or images of war that are happening today. That's traditional news, and it follows the traditional format of the W's, right? The who, what, why, when, where, and hows of journalism, as well as the inverted pyramid format. It's how we've learned that journalism works. This covers, as I said before, topics such as politics, war, economics, and crime. Hard news looks like this, the front page of any newspaper or digital news source. And we're used to looking at this and thinking that everything that comes in this format is news, but that's not necessarily true. It's also important to point out here that not everything in a news story, just because we disagree with the framing of that story, makes it fake. In reality, there are many hard news stories with which we may disagree on the perspective. The second type is soft news. And soft news are those feature stories that don't really have a time pressure for publication. So we may have stories about arts and entertainment. Many of the celebrity stories that we hear about and love so much fall under this idea of soft news. The facts in the stories may be true. Oh, you jumped ahead. The facts in the story may be true, but really the topics are ones that we don't need to know about immediately, and that makes them more soft. And then our flying pumpkin actually describes the kinds of stories that we get this time of year, which are always the pumpkin catapult stories, where they've created those giant catapults and they're heaving pumpkins through the air. That is definitely soft news. It's true, but it's a feature story. This is an example of a soft news story, something that many of you may have seen in your feed yesterday or the day before, a story that isn't really hard news, right? Not something that we need to know to be making decisions about democracy, but something instead that we might be interested in terms of a feature story.
A third element is opinion. And this is an important distinction that we need to make between facts, such as those reported by hard news, and opinion. Opinion articles are articles in which the writer expresses a personal belief, typically one which is controversial or provocative about a particular issue or item of news. And if you read the newspaper regularly, you know that the hard news stories tend to be at the beginning of the newspaper. The opinion stories tend to be in the op-ed section, in the editorial section. But increasingly, we are seeing these blurring, both in terms of print journalism and online. So for example, this is a clearly labeled opinion page. It identifies itself as such. But increasingly, opinion does not identify itself in this way. One of the disturbing things we're realizing is that Americans are not particularly good about distinguishing facts from opinions. So for example, the Pew Research Center 3 days ago reported findings from a study which found that young Americans are actually better than old Americans at distinguishing factual news statements from opinions. And I actually think that they spun their findings in a way that I would not have, because that is an interesting takeaway, that younger Americans may be better at differentiating fact from opinion. But if you take a close look at the graphic on your screen, you'll see that 1 out of 3 young people are actually, only 1 out of 3 young people are able to distinguish between factual and opinion news statements all of the time, whereas only 1 out of 5 people over the age of 50 are able to do so. I think the takeaway from this chart is actually that Americans, regardless of their age, are not very good about distinguishing fact from opinion. And one thing which contributes to this on television cable news programs is the fact that we used to see on cable news programs hard news. For example, CNN Headline News had a 30-minute cycle where they would go through all the headlines in typical format and just continue to do that 24 hours a day. These days, whether you turn on to Fox News or MSNBC or CNN, you're increasingly likely to see opinion, pundits sitting around opining about news events, but they never actually differentiate that from hard news.
Our next point is that much more of the content that we get on the internet is actually sponsored news, which is that is paid for by someone. We're used to seeing that. This is BuzzFeed, for example, and as many of you know, many of the articles on BuzzFeed are sponsored, this one by Pepsi, as you can see. This is their business model, right? Making sure that the people who are paying them have their stories told. But even traditional news outlets have moved into the business of sponsored news because of a decline in advertising dollars. So, for example, this caused much controversy. This was the New York Times, and this feature story, which was an investigative journalism piece that was very in-depth, very important, took a lot of time to put together, was actually paid for by Orange is the New Black. Now, we talked about this the other day in my ethics class, and we were trying to discuss about whether or not this is problematic. And the students, thankfully, pointed out that it mattered what was in the content of the story itself. So were the journalists allowed to investigate the way they would for any journalism story, despite the sponsor, or did the sponsor have some influence on the content itself? But these are questions we're not asking very often, and definitely not often asking of the New York Times. This is another example that was an egregious example. The Atlantic actually sold the front page of their web and print copies to Scientology. There was outrage about this, and this kind of news that is sponsored news is confusing to many readers because it looks like traditional news, and unless you're looking for the cues that say it's sponsored, then you think that it's just another day of journalism. And just to let you know, all different types of publication are selling this as an option. Right here's Runner's World explaining that you can have this kind of article in their publication, and all it would have is this tiny advertisement statement. That leads us to the fifth kind of content that makes things confusing, and that's branded content, or what we call as native advertising in the advertising industry. And these are ads that are designed to look exactly like the medium that they're part of and into which they've been inserted. This is not news at all, but it often mimics the feel of valid content, something from a source that you can trust. It adds to our noise in the newsfeed, making it even harder to distinguish between what is real and what is not in terms of important content. So, for example, a feature such as this in a magazine looks like an article about the Mindy Project, but instead is a virtual shopping center where you can purchase any of these items with just a click of the button. Native ads are everywhere. They're in all of our social media feeds. For example, if you're looking for something to cook tonight, you might be looking at Pinterest. It looks yummy. That's a sponsored post in the middle. This is an Instagram post. These are purposely trying to confuse you and other readers into thinking this is editorial content or something that's being put forward as actual news.
So this brings us to the topic of fake news. What is it? Well, it depends on who you ask. So for example, if you ask President Trump, he would describe fake news much as he did in this classic tweet, saying that the fake news media is the failing New York Times, CNN, NBC News, and many more. It's not my enemy, said President Trump. It's the enemy of the American people. Sick. And I think that regardless of your political orientation, we can all agree that this is how President Trump has used the term fake news. He has used the term to criticize media which actually criticize him or at any point disagree with his policies. But that is not actually the meaning of the term fake news. There's a precise meaning to the term, and that's what we would like to talk about. Fake news is completely false information. It's not biased information. It's not a piece that you see on Fox News or CNN that you kind of disagree with or you don't like the spin. That's not fake news. Fake news is completely fabricated information that is created with either persuasive intent or humorous intent. And typically, when fake news is published, it's published in a format that pretends to be an actual newspaper or pretends to be an actual local TV news station or an actual website. It is created with the intent to deceive. But as you know, fake news is also increasingly a name-calling term that's used to reject information which doesn't match one's personal views. this is an example of actual fake news. This was a story that appeared in a newspaper called the Baltimore Gazette, which supposedly said that the Nobel Peace Prize for their work in negotiating the Iranian arms deal. It was absolutely not true, and there is no such newspaper. The Baltimore Gazette does not exist. This is another example, and this is a very troubling example from a newspaper called the Denver Guardian. According to the Denver Guardian, in a story which appeared just a few days before the 2016 presidential elections, an FBI agent who was supposedly involved in the email leaks from the Clinton campaign was found dead in an apparent murder-suicide. And I remember seeing this circulated in my social media feeds widely and thinking, that seems strange. And when I began Googling it and looking it up, I found that there is no newspaper called the Denver Guardian, and there never has been. So what's going on here? Why are people falling for fake news? Earlier, Jennifer mentioned the problem of information overload. We are bombarded with so much information, we often find that we need to take shortcuts. And if you think about the newspapers that we just saw here, these examples of fake news, and you take a moment to look at those websites, you'll see they really do look quite a bit like an ordinary newspaper website. They have different categories for section heads. Headlines are published in the classic headline typeface. They have little social media icons which show that you can share these articles. I believe there is even a link to job listings. All of these things are actually giving the impression that this is a newspaper. You can see there's a place where people can subscribe by entering their email address. So if you're in a hurry and you see something float by in your news feed at work or late at night, and you just quickly glance at it, you could get the impression this is actually a newspaper. And what this is something that we call peripheral cues. These are external pieces of evidence which give the impression of expertise and authoritativeness. So for example, when we were children, there were often these TV commercials for Hall's cough drops. And there would always be a person, usually a man, sometimes a woman, in a white lab coat standing there saying, "From the halls of medicine, Hall's cough drops will stop the coughing." And of course, they were not scientists or doctors at all. They were actually actors. But the lab coat was a peripheral cue, which suggested some sort of authoritative expertise. And if you take a close look at any of these fake news websites, you'll see that they are using peripheral cues as well.
So why would people create fake news to try to confuse us?
One reason is to make money. In the wake of the 2016 election, when journalists and citizens of all stripes were paying more attention to the topic of fake news, National Public Radio actually tracked down a fake news purveyor, a man named Kohler, who lived actually in the East Bay in the San Francisco Bay Area and maintained multiple fake news websites. And he said he was actually doing it not to sway the election. In fact, he identified more as a liberal than a conservative, but in order to generate money from clicks, from advertising revenue. And he claimed to be earning between $10,000 and $30,000 a day. And I should note, he was creating fake news that targeted liberals as well as conservatives.
The second thing is to just flat out destabilize democracy. And seeing the voting booth there, I'm going to give a shout out again. Please go vote right now. Okay. Well, when we're done. Okay. By sowing discord and driving a wedge between people with differing opinions. For example, this fake Twitter account from a supposed proponent of Black Lives Matter was actually a Russian sock puppet. By making these kinds of incendiary claims about key issues, those who are making fake news are really trying to hope to create a distrust in democracy and having our citizenry not pay attention or be so angry with the government as to find it ineffective and not vote. So we'll counteract that.
Yes, absolutely. And this example that Jennifer has provided also shows how fake news, or this phenomenon of propaganda pretending to be fake news, has also sort of morphed into fake opinion that's distributed on our social media networks. And I think this is where much of the contemporary efforts to destabilize the midterm elections are happening. It's happening in our Twitter feeds. It's happening in our Facebook feeds. And there are still people posting things like this using bots or sock puppet accounts or troll accounts, posting very, very divisive messages which are aimed at driving Americans further and further apart.
So in my ethics class, I never let students get off easy by just being descriptive about situations. So they don't get to just say, this is the problem or this is the way it is. I always make them try to come up with solutions to those problems. So how is it that we can affect change in the world? Because if they don't do it, if you don't do it, who will? And so we've come up with a list of things that I think we all can do to help combat the problem of fake news on the internet.
And the first of these things is to question all claims that you hear. And that includes especially claims that you hear from media outlets that you agree with. If you're a liberal or a conservative, you should be questioning all of the sources you see, especially the things that you most agree with. And part of questioning claims also means doing some research on how people are trying to persuade you, looking for fact-checking sites and other resources that will help you determine the truth. And this is a good time to put in a plug for a site called Propaganda Critic. It was created this summer by Trinity communication professors with support from the Mellon Foundation. And also we had a very two talented students helping us do research on this topic, Mary Margaret Herring and Brandon Guzman, who both were doing research on trolls, sock puppets, bots, and propaganda. And one of the things which came out of this was the Propaganda Critic site.
We also would ask you to please consider the source of the information, no matter what the information is and where you're getting it, through what kind of social media or other website. So look at the source. The source of the news is the outlet that delivers it to you. So the people who are creating that news and serving it up to you. It can be the New York Times or BBC. Look at what else they're publishing and ask if all of the stories are having some kind of slant or bias. Check the facts of those stories as well, but start with the source.
And connected to this, I think that depending upon how long ago you graduated from Trinity University, you might be surprised to know that the sort of categories of sources that made so much sense to us when we were growing up no longer make the same sort of sense in our contemporary information environment. So for example, magazines. You know, you may have grown up in a house that had magazines lying around. You might have had newspapers, and you knew there were different magazines that had different types of credibility. Time magazine, Newsweek magazine were seen as sort of quasi-authoritative, actually authoritative sources about what was happening. There were other magazines you might encounter, like The Economist, which was definitely an excellent source for news about the world. But those categories made sense to us. And increasingly for our students, it all just comes through a screen. And so the sort of judgment that we're asking them to do, to decide, is this an authoritative source or not, they're just operating in a totally different environment. And it becomes much more difficult to make those calls. Another thing that people should be doing is checking the author, simply looking up the identity of the source. And it is so easy to do. Just open up a web page or grab your phone and hold down Siri and hold down that button and say, who is Jennifer Henderson? Or who is whoever the source is that you're listening to? And you will find a result in milliseconds. Literally find out who is the byline written by. And if there is no byline, that is a good tell that this is in fact fake or disinformation. I have no idea what this is.
Yeah, that's not true. This is actually the author from the source before. And so if you click on the author of sources online, you can actually get the kinds of things that they've published before. This will tell you what they're experts in, what they publish most regularly, and you'll be able to tell. Sometimes you'll go to a page such as this and it'll be empty. That should be a big clue as to like the validity of the source itself.
Absolutely. And you might be wondering, well, what about bots? You know, how do we find out when checking the source or looking something up? If we think a source is not credible, how do we find out if they're a bot? There is a project called Botometer or Botometer. We're not sure. Tomato, tomato, yeah. Botometer, botometer. This is a resource which will allow you to enter somebody's Twitter handle, and it will search just a number of factors, including how frequently it posts, how often it retweets, and come up with a rough approximation, sort of a percentage of certainty that, like, 87% certain this might be a bot. But this tool does make mistakes. And so you can't, I wouldn't take away someone's due process because of this and say, you're a bot. You have to do a little extra legwork, but it is a good starting point.
And I actually started using this as part of a research project this summer with a student that Aaron had mentioned, who was doing a study on computational propaganda and the Maryland primary this summer. And so we started out by checking, using the botometer to check sources that we thought were probably suspicious. And then we did additional research from there. It was a great first layer of a tool. One of the things we found in that study that's really interesting is that many of the sources actually are finding new ways to get around algorithms. So it's not as if the fake comments are going away. It's just they're doing them in different ways. And so one of the ways that they were doing them in our study was posting as potential job opportunities in different states. And so they would say, like, want to work in Alaska? And then the comment below it, or the link when you linked to it, was something political in nature. And so it was set up as a way to get around many of the new. Twitter's been taking down a lot of bot accounts, and this was a new way for them to get around the algorithm. You should also check the date. So the date not just of the headline, but the dates of the photos themselves. And if you don't know how to do Google reverse image search, you should Google it and figure out how to do it right now. The recycling of old quotes in a news story is definitely points to problematic news. This doesn't happen in hard news stories, right, that are about things that are right now, unless they say, like 5 years ago and have a quote. Reposting old news stories doesn't mean that they're relevant to current events, but this is doubly true for images. Oftentimes, to make a point, we'll say that this image, like here, are all these buses that are lined up, but in reality, this is 3 different images from 3 different times, none of them. Please take the time to look at the images that get posted with the comments so you'll know whether or not they're valid.
And related to this as a peripheral observation, I am amazed at how many intelligent people seem to believe that anything that's published as a fact with a little meme-like GIF is necessarily true. There are just so many dubious claims floating around on social media, and somehow people act as if just putting it onto a GIF is going to absolutely make it true.
And then what seems very obvious, we think, but you really should ask yourself, is this a joke? So on many, many occasions, traditional news sources even have picked up onion stories and run them as fact. They end up having to back out of those, obviously. But just think, does this seem like it could be a joke? Then maybe I should double check whether or not it's a joke. And so start from that premise, and that will help you for sure.
There's a columnist for The New Yorker who often from a liberal perspective will write these sort of joke news stories that take what's happening in the news 1, 2, 3 steps further, just to the edge of believability. And I have seen many people fall for those in my social media feed. Another thing that we all need to do is check our biases. And this is important to do because of something called confirmation bias, and it affects all of us. Basically, what that says is that we tend to filter out information that contradicts our biases, it contradicts our beliefs, and we tend to perceive as credible and more believable information which confirms our beliefs. And I wish I could tell you that as communication professors, we've somehow transcended this bias. But one of the really frustrating things about cognitive biases, such as confirmation bias, is that it's always there. It's always operating. And so one of the things you can do is sort of ask yourself, when you're reacting in an emotional way or in an emphatic way with something you see on the news, is think why do I want to believe this? Or why do I want to disbelieve this? And that is something you can do that will help.
We would ask you to double check your hunches. So if a claim seems like it could be false, it very well might be. There are a lot of sites that check out specific claims. PolitiFact obviously checks out ones that have to do with politics itself. Snopes is another good example, but there are a number of websites on the internet that are really trying to help you figure out what is real and what is not in terms of the claims that are embedded in content.
And one of the things that you'll find is that people who are trying to distribute fake news, regardless of their political orientation, will also try to discredit the fact-checking sites. So there's been a massive propaganda campaign to discredit Snopes, for example, or to discredit PolitiFact or factcheck.org. But these sources that we're mentioning, they truly are credible sources. They have clearly documented methodologies that are displayed on their homepage. And I think that's one thing you can reach for if you're in a discussion with someone who's rejecting a fact-checking site. You can point out the methodology that's used and also draw people's attention to the fact that these fact-checking sites are also including sources. They cite their sources. They provide links to primary and secondary sources to support their claims.
And finally, in terms of our tips, and maybe the most important, you've got to support journalism. And so what happened when we moved from paper to digital in terms of the news realm is that many of the companies were afraid to charge for their product because they felt that no one would pay for them. And they would just carry forth the advertising model that had been part of what was in newspapers originally to the internet. And now we've grown very much accustomed to getting our news for free. So we get really frustrated when we get that message that says, you've used your 3 clicks on this site today, or you're only allowed to view the top half of the story. If you want to do more, you can subscribe. And I would wholeheartedly encourage you to subscribe, because if we can support real hard news journalism, we can overcome some of these other problems with fake news.
Absolutely. And also with emerging media such as podcasts and blogs, there are hard-hitting journalists doing great work in both of those media channels. And they often are subsidized by Patreon subscriptions. So you can give $2 a month or $5 a month, depending upon your means and how much you appreciate the content. But it really is something that we can all do to support authentic news.
Go ahead. We're going to end.
So we're going to end by showing you a clip of sort of what the future of fake news and disinformation might look like. And it's, we'll let Jordan Peele speak for himself. I can narrate it, or we can talk about it. So it's okay. So we'll just direct you to later go to YouTube and search for Fake News Jordan Peele. He's been drawing our attention to new technologies that have been developed.
Greater effectiveness.
Which
That's
make
the
it
point
possible
of this new video from Jordan Peele.
Our enemies can make it look like anyone is saying anything at any point in time.
Former President Barack Obama, right?
So, for instance, they could have me say things like, I don't know, Killmonger was right.
Wrong.
You see, I would never say these things, but someone else would. Someone like Jordan Peele.
Comedian Jordan Peele actually produced this video to warn about the future of fake news. The technology uses sophisticated artificial intelligence tools able to turn familiar faces, even presidents, into puppets.
Now there is software that can be purchased and done at home, and within a few days you can manufacture what someone says in a video.
Most people use it for harmless fun, like inserting Nicolas Cage into movies where he doesn't belong. But it can be scary stuff. Recently, hackers took this image of Parkland High School senior Emma Gonzalez tearing up a gun range target for Teen Vogue. They manipulated it to come up with a clip that appeared to show her tearing up the Constitution instead. Just the sort of nefarious use Jordan Peele and BuzzFeed, which co-produced the video, is warning about.
Moving forward, we need to be more vigilant with what we trust from the internet.
The message here that it's getting harder and harder to trust our eyes and ears.
Sure is. It's hard to determine the veracity. So how do we know what's legit and what's fake in terms of videos out there?
Two big pieces of advice. Look at the source, and Google's your friend when in doubt.
Double check.
Double check. Trust but verify.
Thanks, David.
So did you want to say something about that?
Yeah, so right now we have these 8 things that we can work on and do to look at fake news, but we know that in the future this is going to be harder and harder. So we'll probably have to do a webinar like this like every year.
Before we get into the Q&A session, we wanted to let you know that there is another webinar scheduled for November 9th at noon Central Time on, quote, the future of Trump, the impact of the 2018 midterm elections. And this is a live webinar conversation with David Crockett, Ph.D., Chair and Professor of the Political Science Department here at Trinity University, and Robert Rivard, Editor and Publisher of the Rivard Report, and former longtime editor of the San Antonio Express News.
All right, so let's start in with our questions. We have quite a few. Our first is from Thomas. Hey, Thomas, it's good to see you through virtually. Recently, he writes, I've been reading about the FCC fairness doctrine. Do you think something like that would help the current situation, or do you think it would be too easily manipulated for political or economic gains? Would it even be relevant in an age of digital news?
My personal feeling is that the fairness doctrine was a bad idea. It was an attempt to clamp down on unfair content, but it really was directed primarily at conservative viewpoints for many years. And I think that actually really set back, speaking as a liberal, I think that set back the cause of liberalism quite a bit, because it's not that silencing views you disagree with means that they're going to go away. It just meant that people organized and talked about things in different spaces. And then obviously those views persisted. I think any attempt for the government to decide to impose some sort of restrictions like this would be a very bad idea. But I will defer to the free speech scholar sitting next to me.
And actually, I think that one of the important things to think about the fairness doctrine is that in theory, we all love the theory of the fairness doctrine, right? That we're going to have a press that covers multiple perspectives. And that's what we want to have from the press, right? Instead of having one position, we'd like them to not just have 2, but 3 or 4 positions. The problem with the fairness doctrine is that it really says there are only 2 viewpoints, that it's either liberal or conservative. And the reality of our world is that there are multiple viewpoints. So if we're trying to tell truthful stories, the fairness doctrine kind of gets in our way of doing that.
So the next question is from an anonymous attendee who asks, what do you all think about BuzzFeed's growing hard news feed?
Hello to our friends who work at BuzzFeed's news department. I think that it's great. BuzzFeed has been putting more and more resources into their hard news operations, and that's only good for us.
Absolutely. I do think that it's important for people to differentiate. Just as they need to differentiate between, opinion and hard news, differentiate between actual BuzzFeed news and the BuzzFeed quizzes about which Harry Potter character are you.
Those are my favorites sometimes. Yeah, the quizzes. All right. And so Francis asks, can one always trust the news published in major newspapers like the New York Times, the Washington Post, or the San Francisco Chronicle?
I would say yes. That doesn't mean that newspapers always get it right. But the reason I say that you can trust newspapers is because it is a really big deal to journalists when they get it wrong. They apologize, they retract, people lose their jobs. And there have been cases of newspapers getting it wrong, across the spectrum. It's not a left-right thing. It's just people make mistakes. But journalism is committed to reporting the truth and correcting those mistakes. And I do believe you can trust those sources. Pay attention, but trust them.
I would agree. I would say that those sources are in the business of hard news primarily. They care very much about the truth and working toward the truth as hard as they can. And so while sometimes perspective of bias may come into a news story, or perspective that you disagree with, or they've made a mistake, it really is the closest we can get to actual hard facts in our news on the internet today.
But I don't think either one of us would say you should just trust one newspaper or just one source. You should be looking at multiple sources, but we think you can trust them.
Right. That's one of the takeaways we really want people to have, is that it's important that you read widely. So don't just, focus on one source every day and only go to that source. It's very interesting how these stories are being told differently across multiple sources. Not always good, but interesting.
Absolutely.
All right, Patrick. What is the best way to address fake news when you see it being propagated by friends and family, including your favorite aunt? Oh, it's always that favorite aunt, in their social media feeds. Aaron spends more time on social media than I do, so I'll let him take this question.
I think that the way not to do it is to publicly challenge them and say, oh my God, Aunt so-and-so, not another fake story, and link to Snopes. I think that publicly challenging people really threatens their face, and it's going to damage the relationship. I do think it is important to point it out to them, and I think that's something you could do with a private direct message or private Facebook message. I guess that's my best answer. But I mean, sometimes people really just refuse to accept evidence which disproves what they believe, and that's very frustrating. And I have a very good friend, a colleague, who regularly encounters this in his social media networks, people he went to high school with. And I've always been very impressed with the civil tone that he brings to those conversations. He makes his point, he explains why he's disproved the fake news, but at the same time, there's just still some respect of each other's fundamental decency and sincerity and authenticity. And I think that's the thing that separates the people that we disagree with from bots and sock puppets is, I mean, we may disagree. Somebody may be subscribing to fake news, but they're speaking authentically from the heart. And I think that if somebody is speaking to you from the heart, that's an important relationship to maintain.
I always ask my students to think about those conversations as if they're sitting at the Thanksgiving dinner table and those people are across, from them passing them the mashed potatoes, right? And so the kinds of conversations you want to have face to face are the kinds of conversations you want to be having online as well. And that definitely leads to more civility in these conversations.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Here's a question about what's the link to the Propaganda Critic site?
Oh, it's propagandacritic.com. And yeah.
We'll make sure that it gets linked along with this presentation, for sure. It's a great resource. And there was a question about any efforts, ideas, discussions about integrating into K through 12. And actually, a lot of K through 12 teachers use the Propaganda Critic site as the basis. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Oh, yeah. Just the Propaganda Critic site has been around for a while and has been used in many classrooms. And also, it's part of a larger effort of media literacy educators to get the word out about all of the ways that content is manipulated. So it might be called propaganda analysis, it might be called media literacy, but the same basic message of thinking about how we receive information, the biases that affect how things get to us and how we perceive it, that we need to look things up. That's common across all of those approaches. I think the challenge many educators face is finding the time to bring it into the classroom, especially when people are focusing so much on preparing for tests. We see fewer schools have good civics classes, and history becomes compressed. But I think there are teachers all over the place who would love to have more time to speak about this.
And I know I keep mentioning my ethics class, but I will one more time. They just finished an assignment, actually, where I asked them to write lesson plans for K through 12 educators, because they're closer to them than I am, for sure, about how to address these kinds of issues with kids of all ages. And so I had students writing from like fourth graders through high school seniors, asking them to look at fake news in different kinds of ways. And if you're interested in that, feel free to get a hold of me, Jennifer.Henderson at Trinity.edu, and I'd be happy to send you some of their suggestions as well. So Jeff says, just an FYI, I agree with this. It was on the internet, so it has to be true. May seem like a joke to many, but all too many accept this concept.
Yes, we agree. And I think that we just need to educate people to realize that's not the case.
Yeah, Trent asks, how do you decipher the difference between opinion and fact on cable news? This is definitely a challenge. And I would say that anytime there are multiple people on a panel or multiple windows, so it looks like the Brady Bunch, I call it the Brady Bunch screen. Whenever the Brady Bunch screen is up, you will know that those are opinions. Those are people's opinions. Sometimes they're experts in certain areas. Sometimes they're just people who have agreed to speak on a certain issue. And so I would say that's always opinion.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's unrealistic, but I wish that the cable news networks, as an act of journalistic responsibility, would begin just kind of framing the video with something that said opinion or news. I mean, I know that it doesn't always fall into like 30-minute segments anymore like it used to, but I think that would help just to kind of re-articulate those distinctions. But it is very hard to tell, and I'd say most of cable news content these days is probably opinion.
They lead at the top of the hours often with and it's always breaking news, right, on these things. So when it says breaking news, those first few sentences are probably hard news. Almost everything else these days is opinion, unfortunately. And then Ben asks us, I've seen some discussion of a certification process for journalists in which journalists could choose to go through a process to attain a certification from professional journalist associations and list their certification on their bylines, which would be hyperlinked to a site to verify when they were certified and by what organization. What thoughts do you have on this suggestion? What considerations would weigh in evaluating this proposal? And does it create an unfair barrier to entry in the field for new journalists? Would it be helpful for readers trying to assess the credibility of sources?
That's a really interesting idea. I think that a certification system I would really be suspicious of, just because of the potential to abuse it, to deny certification to people for some reason. I do think it's an excellent idea for all journalists to make sure that their bylines are available and that there's an easily accessed short biography about them and their background. I think newspapers, blogs, citizen journalists could definitely help by making sure that they go an extra mile to kind of identify these things. But personally, I would be opposed to a certification program.
And as a First Amendment historian, I would say that it has never helped or been a good thing to take the power of the press away from the people. So the way that our law looks at it, everyone is a journalist and we all have the same rights to ask questions. I think this is particularly important when we think about the kinds of information that are being collected on the spot about different issues that are going on, whether it has to do with police or polling or any of those kinds of things. I think that it is a system that would be open to much potential corruption, and I would rather have us all be journalists and act like journalists, having supportive claims, rather than certify people who want to have the tagline.
I agree.
Yay. Thank you. Yeah. Walter says, what do we do with real news outlets who report some other news source has reported this or that, but we have not independently verified it?
That's a good question. I think it's great to recognize that and to kind of put a pin on the claim that you hear being reported by CNN or Fox or whoever the outlet is, because what is cool though is the journalists are being responsible. They're saying there's this claim being made by another outlet. We have not yet independently verified it. We are not going to stake our credibility on it. So I think that it's good to pay attention to those things.
And I think it's very important that those organizations then follow up and do the thing they should in terms of journalistic practice and say what the actual facts that they have found as a new news organization are, rather than just relying on other unsubstantiated claims. And I think that we call that speculation journalism, right? We think this thing happened, and then we have opinion talking about whether or not they think it happened. But until we have some verification that events happen, I think it's important that we continue to question those things.
Mm-hmm. Trevor says, how do you use fake news, how do you see fake news distinctions playing into casual conversations about politics between people with different views, if such conversations even take place anymore? Do you see people calling out, check your sources in casual conversation? I wish, actually, and I wish it wasn't seen as a hostile act to ask somebody about their sources. I think that it'd be great if we cultivated as citizens of a democracy a sort of democratic habit, temperament of saying, oh, really, who said that? What's their credibility? What's their expertise? I don't see that happening as often as it should.
And I think that those conversations are still taking place. They take place in the classroom, for example. Thankfully, at Trinity, students are very kind to one another and listen to each other's positions. And they'll often question each other just in this way. And I kind of wish we could take that and make it whole, so all of the United States was asking each other questions in these polite, thoughtful, important ways. But for the time being, I agree with Dr. Delwiche. We need to just be saying, so where does that information come from? And maybe it's not, hey, what's your source? Because that turns people off every once in a while.
Yeah, and I think that it's really important for all of us to try to make sure those conversations don't disappear, that they don't just exist in the classroom. I mean, this is a democracy. We're supposed to be able to talk to people we disagree with, and at the end of the day, move forward. And I think it's really clear that these propaganda campaigns are intended to drive Americans apart from each other, to kind of just push at a democracy and push at all of our open wounds and make it harder and harder for us to engage in democracy. And I think that we can insist in our interactions with other human beings that we're going to not do that we are going to allow ourselves to disagree and be respectful and maybe even allow ourselves to change our minds from time to time.
It looks like that. Oh, wait. Here's a question about the Red Blues News Flow website is on the Wall Street Journal site. And it's just called the Red Blue feed. So if you look up Red Blue feed and Wall Street Journal, you'll be able to reach that. And I think, have we come to the end of our questions?
Yes. Hi, Stephanie. By the way, we saw your message. Hello.
Yeah, it was very nice of you to write in. And we want to remind everybody again, November 9th is the next of these webinars, The Future of Trump, the Impact on the 2018 Midterm Elections. I can't wait to hear what Dr. Crockett and Robert Rivard have to say about this. It's an interesting and important time. Again, please go vote and have a really great day.